Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview on doing sociology. Today, we have with us Professor James Manor, who has been a Professor Emeritus in the School of Advanced Study, University of London. He has previously taught at Yale, Harvard, and Leicester universities, as well as at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore. Some of his recent books include Politics and State-Society Relations in India, Politics and the Right to Work, India's National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and Against the Odds, Politicians, Institutions, and the Struggle Against Poverty. We welcome you, Professor Manor, and thank you so much for taking time out to do this for us.
Thank you.
Right. So to begin with, you have studied India for decades, and you say that India today has entered a new, fundamentally different political order, entering what you describe as competitive authoritarianism. You also mentioned that a narrow focus on party politics cannot help us understand the nature that the nature of the attack that democracies are facing today. So could you please elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, the concept of competitive authoritarianism has been developed to analyze several governments around the world. And I think India is, since 2014, and especially since 2019, India is an example of a competitive authoritarian system. That is to say, it's not a liberal democracy anymore. It may return to being a liberal democracy, but it has ceased to be, it has stopped being a liberal democracy in recent times because the current government is seeking to create a more authoritarian order in which is competitive authoritarianism. That is, other parties are permitted to compete for power, but the system is tilted against them radically, so that, for example, at the 2019 election, the ruling party had 18 times more money to spend than all other political parties put together. The government seeks to persuade independent institutions like the courts and the election commission to rule in its favor. It has the bureaucracy tilting the balance in its favor. It uses coercive force to intimidate alternative power centers, that is, alternative political parties, but also alternative power centers outside the party system. It leans on the media to get heavily biased media coverage in its favor, and so on. So you have a system in which is elections take place, but it's very difficult for the opposition parties to win elections because the playing field is tilted in favor of the ruling party. Having said that, I should just mention that the ruling party has had problems winning elections at the state level in India. They've done quite well at the national level, but they have an embarrassingly long string of elections at the state level where they either lose or they do much less well. They fall short of their hopes. And we have 5 more state elections coming up. This is a serious problem for the ruling party, but it doesn't mean that this is not now a competitive authoritarian political system.
Right. So, the next question is kind of in that sense related, because how do you then analyze the interconnections that exist between politics and development in South Asia, particularly in the context of decentralization of power in India?
Yes, well, to discuss the relationship between politics and development in South Asia would take me 2 or 3 of these sessions. That question alone, it's so huge that I'm reluctant to start. But I should say that if we focus on decentralization in India, then we are on to something that's more controllable, a topic that's more controllable, but also quite an encouraging story. In 1993, the 73rd and 74th Amendments to the Constitution were passed, and elected councils were created under the 73rd Amendment, created at 3 levels in rural areas. And then, of course, the 74th Amendment addressed the issue of urban democracy and decentralization. Since that time, several states, not all states, but several states in India have very generously given powers and resources to elected councils at lower levels. And we now know, having had lots of studies of these things, some of which I've done, but more important studies have been done by colleagues in recent times. We now have evidence to show that when local democracy is allowed to work for a significant amount of time, all of the people at the village level learn how the system works, because they can see what's going on. They can see what local elections produce. They can see the actions of the local council between elections. And even poor people who have never entered politics or the public sphere before begin to understand how the system works and begin to become more active, more confident as political actors, better connected as political actors. And so poorer groups are increasingly able to use their collective strength, their voting power, to obtain positive action from the local councils. And we now know that democratic decentralization has all sorts of virtues, including providing early warnings against looming disasters like droughts and outbreaks of disease, in making government more accountable, as a counterweight to corruption, which is a complicated story, but decentralization tends to restrict corruption. And we now know that because the poorer groups in the villages gradually learn how to play the political game, the local game well, they're increasingly able to assert themselves and to get gains, to get benefits out of the local political process. And so we can say we now have a very important book by 2 Indians and a Swiss scholar on this subject. And we can now say that democratic decentralization can help to reduce poverty. It's a complicated story, but that's an extremely important point, because for a long time that did not seem to be the case. So the story of India has set the pace across the world in democratic decentralization. It has demonstrated the benefits of it much more effectively than any other country, even though a few other countries, Brazil especially, have also gone in for a serious democratic decentralization. But that story, that Indian story, is extremely encouraging.
Right. So next question, Professor Manor, is sort of connected to this, and also a very important question, because in India particularly, this term and this has been under much debate in the last year or so. Firstly, how do you relate to the context of decentralization of power in India? How do you relate citizenship to it, and what does citizenship mean in this context? And then what are the values that make one a citizen?
Yeah, this is an extremely complex question, and I'm not an authority on it on the subject by any means, by any matter, in any sense. And I think if you look at the work of Professor Nirja Gopal Jayal, for example, at the JNU, just retired from JNU, soon to join the University of London, you will find a much more sophisticated discussion of citizenship than I can give you. What I will say is that elected local councils, which have power in many Indian states, have over the last 30 years created opportunities for rather passive local residents to become more like active citizens, citizens who actually understand the promise of the democratic system and begin to act to fulfill that promise. And what has happened in many Indian villages because of decentralization is that a lot of poor people, and especially poor women who previously never even emerged from the houses in some parts of India, have entered the public sphere, have become more politically capable. Four things have happened. They have become more aware of how the political system works and how democracy locally works. More aware, they've become more confident as political actors because they're more aware and because they see that they can make a difference if they become active. They become more skilled politically. As they become more active, they learn political skills. And finally, they have become better connected. They form new connections with other people, poor people like them, and with non-poor allies. And so these four things, awareness, confidence, skills, and connections, add up to an increased political capacity of poor people and other people in villages as a result of democratic Panchayati Raj, democratic local government. And this, I think, means that these people are becoming more fully citizens and not just residents of the village. They're citizens because they have a political awareness and can engage constructively in the political process. But for a fuller picture of the citizenship issue, you need to ask more sophisticated colleagues of mine.
Right. So then moving on from the question of citizenship, and then I want to ask you something based on what you've written, and that is on cities. So what role do cities play in policy processes? And then to quote you from one of your papers, where you've written that cities are sources of revenues, economic growth, and illicit fundraising, but cities are also potential sites of disorder, and leaders who favor cities risk alienating rural voters who decide election outcomes. So politicians are caught in cross currents. What are these cross currents?
Well, you've begun to identify the cross currents in your question, and politicians. I'm thinking now of state level politicians who have to deal up close and personal with urban actors and urban centers. Not so much people sitting in New Delhi in Parliament or in the cabinet, but at the state level. Politicians have a kind of love-hate relationship with the big cities in their states. And as you say, as I said, and as you quoted me, I mean, the politicians want their state governments to get revenue. And they want to create jobs, see jobs created in their states to keep younger people happy and to promote the general welfare. And so the politicians certainly want economic growth to take place, to provide revenues, to provide jobs, and therefore they will sometimes take actions to improve things in the urban centers so that economic growth can flourish. And I don't just mean government funding economic growth, but I mean government creating opportunities for businesses to create economic growth. But if the politicians are seen to be doing many nice things for cities, then rural voters may become a little bit unhappy because they think that the cities are getting all the benefits and the rural areas are not. And I know politicians at the state level in many states worry a lot about this because in most Indian states, rural votes greatly outnumber urban votes. So rural voters decide who forms the next government. So if you want to get reelected, you don't want to alienate the rural voters. That's less true in certain states like Maharashtra, where there's a substantial urbanization. But in most Indian states, the majority is clearly out there in the rural areas. Another problem for politicians is that, as you suggested, that public order problems can crop up there, rioting or just disorder on a smaller scale, crime, and cities are rather hard to control, and politicians may therefore be tempted to use really tough police measures to deal with urban areas, even though they want to see the urban centers flourish and create growth and jobs and the rest. Politicians also in many Indian cities have to deal with organized crime, with a criminal underworld. Sometimes the criminal underworld is an attractive thing to some unscrupulous politicians because they make deals with powerful criminals and money changes hands and so on. But on the other hand, the criminal underworld can become a kind of uncontrollable force unto itself that can create problems for politicians. And urban voters may think, well, crime is a huge problem. We need a new government. Let's throw out politicians. And so politicians have mixed feelings about the criminal underworld, which, by the way, has grown enormously in its reach and its power over the last 40 years or so. And for example, I once did a study about urban South India around about 1980-81. And at that time, there was only one city in the whole of South India where organized crime was a serious force. And the city was not Chennai or Bangalore. The city was Vijayawada on the coast of Andhra, for complicated reasons. But today, if you go to any significant urban center in South India, you will find organized crime is present in strength because it's extended its operations across urban, and it's principally urban areas, urban South India. So the organized crime is a concern. And finally, cities tend to be potential sites of severe violence, especially communal violence. And there, if we start looking at that, as my colleague Ashutosh Varshney has done in a very fine book, if we look at that, we find that there are two sides to the story. On the one hand, in some of Indian cities, there are really no civil society organizations have built no bridges or very weak bridges between Hindu and Muslim groups in the cities. And in other Indian cities, careful work by constructive civil society organizations has been done to build quite solid bridges between Hindu and Muslim groups or Hindu and Christian groups. And as a result, when tensions crop up in those cities with strong bridges, major violence tends not to happen. But in cities that don't have any such bridges, communal violence tends to be quite common. So cities are sites where severe, dire violence can take place, but they are also sites where civil society can build bridges in a constructive way, quite remarkably, to prevent violence from breaking out. And this is important. This is a fact about urban India, and it is not. It does not apply to rural India, because in rural India, in villages, it's much more difficult to build the kind of bridges that I'm talking about to prevent violence from taking place. That's another story.
Right. So we cannot discuss Indian politics in India without looking at the question of caste. And you have been engaged with the question of caste itself and looking at its evolution too. So what do you think has changed over the decades? And do you feel that there has been a fundamental shift in the manner that the two have intersected?
Well, there are two kind of huge issues here, and I will try to speak to both of them. But the first one is, I'll just say a couple of quick things about the first thing. When I began to study Indian politics in the early 70s, it's a long time ago, most Indian states were governed by the Congress Party, and the Congress Party was governing because it had the support of the dominant landowning caste groups in rural areas. Those groups controlled Congress, and through Congress, they largely controlled governments at the state level. By the mid-80s or so, Congress Party dominance had been eroded, and so had, in many areas, so had the political dominance of the landowning groups. Other social groups, other caste groups and class groups had begun to emerge in strength. And so caste still remained important in politics, but it did not, the landed castes could not dominate politics at the state level any longer. And so now caste remains important in politics, but you have an extremely complicated patchwork of groups that come together and then fall apart, come together in clusters of caste and then fall apart when they disagree about things and so on. You have an extremely complicated story, which drives politicians crazy because they need to keep on top of this and maintain a broad base. That's a extremely inadequate quick answer on the question of politics and caste, on which we could spend hours. But there is something else here that I think really needs to be understood, and it's not widely discussed in India, and that is there's been a fundamental change in the role of caste and in the nature of rural society in India since about 1990. We've had clear evidence of this from social scientists at the village level in rural India since 1994. And there's an enormous amount of evidence on this to support this idea. And the idea is that that one of the fundamental features of rural society in India, which is caste hierarchy, hierarchy is no longer accepted as it was before, say, 1970, in rural areas among disadvantaged social groups, thinking of OBCs and Dalits in the rural areas. And so a fundamental element of the social order in rural India, caste hierarchy, has been rejected by those at the lower end of the hierarchy. This is important partly because 2/3 of Indians still live in villages. Let's not forget that. It's frequently overlooked. And second, I think this change is one of the two most important changes to take place in India since independence. The fundamental character of the rural social order has changed because this pillar that supported it, caste hierarchy, has been knocked away. And so what I have done in recent years is to visit several states to try to understand what the implications are of the rejection of caste hierarchy by disadvantaged caste groups in villages. And the answers are that I've come up with. I've visited 9 states and 12 regions, if you consider sub-regions within states and so on, at the village level. And I've talked to anthropologists and sociologists in many other states and so on. And what emerges as a complicated picture, on the one hand, because disadvantaged social groups reject caste hierarchies in villages. This creates inter-caste tension everywhere. The tension sometimes leads to violence, so there has been clearly an increase in inter-caste violence, usually higher castes attacking Dalits and others in recent times. But there has also been an increase in the number of cases in which amid social tension, accommodations, agreements, understandings have been developed to avoid violence. And these accommodations have taken place in a huge number of localities. And we have no kind of way of measuring the exact number of violent incidents and the exact number of agreements and accommodations which avoid violence in villages. But I'm fairly sure, having been around a great deal of India, that the number of accommodations greatly outnumber the incidents, the violent incidents that make the newspaper headlines. Quiet accommodations to avoid violence don't get into the newspapers, but they are much more common than the violent inter-caste violence has been. And therefore, one needs to look at how the accommodations, how do they negotiate accommodations between, say, Dalits and landowning castes, or Dalits and OBCs, and how likely are these accommodations to prevent violence over the longer term, and so on. And I've written studies to discuss these issues with rather complicated picture. But this is an important area where change is taking place, which I think needs to be looked at by more people, because I'm not in a position to write a definitive final study of this. But I hope other people will have a look at it and try to understand both the violence and the accommodations, and understand perhaps how conditions might change, which would make accommodations more difficult. That's another piece of the picture. But this is something that it cries out for study by sociologists and others.
Right. So, Professor Manor, the final question, sort of drawing from what you've just said, how inter-caste relations have been changing in the rural, and that has sort of led to more caste violence. So, if we could draw from some of the examples, maybe in the recent times, where we've witnessed such violence.
Yes. Well, the kind of severe violence I'm talking about tends to happen within individual localities, where, for example, a landowning caste that has traditionally dominated a village finds that the Dalits or the very disadvantaged OBC groups are behaving in ways that seem to the landed castes to be intolerably arrogant. And then there are occasions where the landed groups may decide to arm themselves with whatever, clubs, guns, or whatever, and descend upon the section of the village in which the Dalits live, and to attack them physically. This may happen. It can happen for all kinds of reasons. It can even happen because two households in the village, a Dalit household and a landowning caste household, somehow get into a dispute or something, and it escalates. In any case, such violence can break out and become. It appears, from what we know, that when such violence breaks out in villages, the violence is much more severe, much more vicious than it was say 30 or 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago, if some kind of incident took place in which one member of the lower caste community somehow seemed to misbehave in the eyes of higher castes, then that one person might be taken away and beaten up or something, and he would be taught a lesson, as the higher castes would put it, and that would be the end of the story. But in recent times, we find that many more people tend to be involved in these incidents. Collective violence is more common, and that violence tends to be more vicious and lethal than 30 years ago. Having said all this, I stress that violence is less common than accommodations in villages, so I don't want to over dramatize. But there are several things to note about this, and that is, first of all, that when a violent episode takes place in one village, it almost never spreads to neighboring villages, which is very interesting and very reassuring. If you go to an urban center and violence breaks out in one section of a town or a city, whether it's between caste groups or religious groups, there is a very strong danger that violence will spread to other parts of the same city or town, and many more people will be involved. In rural areas, this doesn't seem to happen. The explanation is no doubt complicated, and I've only begun to try to see it, but that's one thing to notice, that it tends to be localized intercaste violence. And the second thing that struck me when I went around many different states, that I was consistently told by people in villages near villages that had violence that they had learned a lesson from the village where the violence took place. They had learned that violence poisons all kinds of social relationships for good, forever. That economic life, normal religious festival, all sorts of things in the village where there was violence becomes very difficult. And that violence is damaging not just on the day that it takes place when somebody is beaten or killed, but violence poisons things over the longer term. And people in neighboring villages tended to draw this lesson from watching what happened in villages where there was violence. And this made them much less inclined to engage in violence in the future. And so there are all kinds of extra aspects to this story, which would take me too long to cover. But I think social scientists should look at these things carefully. Indian social scientists are extremely well placed to look at these things themselves. It's harder for outsiders like me to do it, because I lack the kind of intimate understanding of any regional society, and these are well worth examining. So I would just encourage my colleagues in India to have a go.
Right, so we've come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much, Professor Manor, for taking time out and talking to us today. We've touched upon some very important themes, and I'm sure our viewers will take a lot from this conversation which we've had with you today. So thank you once again for participating in this interview.
Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Manor.